not only do I have this terrific introduction, which made me start feeling a bit tired, because I thought, did I do all of that? And apparently, I pretty much did all of that, you know? But I'm old, too, right? That's why. You know, you got to start young and stay with it. That's how you do all that. But the second thing that's really disturbing to me this evening is I'm in the unfortunate position of giving a talk before they feed you. When Union said, you can give the talk and then we'll go to dinner afterwards, I sort of envisioned we're just going to drop. I can talk for hours, you all will just be hearty, and then we go to the bar and have a drink and have dinner. I did not envision that I would be keeping you from your food, all right? So I'm going to try my best. I'm going to try my best to really stay on point tonight. I have a very, unfortunately for you, I have a really heavy-duty presentation. I'm not the before-dinner speaker that says, social justice is good. The world is full of social injustice. So we should stand up against social injustice. For social justice, alright? Unfortunately for you, I have brought a fairly complicated PowerPoint. This is drawn from my work. As some of you have read the New Politics of Community, in that particular piece I argue that the concept of community is a political term that is being struggled over. There's a battle for definition. And when people take over a term and redefine it in ways that work for them, we have to ask ourselves, what's the value of that term? Why is it being taken over the way it is? So tonight I'm going to take on a sacred cow, the notion of community service, which everybody seems to think is so wonderful. Well, it is. I mean, I'm sure the people here say, my gosh, she must be against mom died in apple pie, too. How can anybody be against, not against community service, but why should we think about it? So, let me just start off by sort of telling you how I got to the top, just sort of setting the stage a little bit. I'm going to assume that because this is a fairly prestigious and well-read audience, you've heard of Martin Luther King. Now, keep in mind, I give talks to many different types of audiences, and you also should keep in mind that I have been on my best behavior for 3 years when I was elected, actual and immediate past president of the American Sociological Association, which meant I had to represent the organization and I had to be dignified and presidential. Now, that was a strain for me. It really, really was. So tonight I would like to talk in a more conversational way with my PowerPoint. I'm going to put slides up there. I may not go into a huge amount about each one, but I will be going through them fairly quickly. But to tell you how I got to this point, talking about Martin Luther King. I'm assuming that all of you at one point in time were 19, 20 years old. Yes? All right, we have a few people, I mean, it was a while ago. I know, some of you have to really dig back, all right? But when I was 19, 20 years old, somewhere in there, I was a junior in college, and I wrote a paper on Martin Luther King Jr. And basically, in my paper, I went out and I read everything that I could find in print at that time about Martin Luther King Jr. and his mission for social justice. I considered Martin Luther King to be both a radical and a moderate. And if you were working within African American communities, and if you were interested in black studies at that point in time, black folks saw Martin Luther King as moderate. They saw Malcolm X as radical. But if you were looking from the perspective of the broader society, Martin Luther King Jr. was radical, communist, scary, and dangerous. So I'm doing this paper on Martin Luther King Jr., and he is assassinated. Right? Now, the liberal think tank up in Cambridge, Mass., where I was actually, my professor worked for this liberal think tank, all looked at each other and said, my gosh, there are no white people here. It's just us white people in the room, and we don't know anything about Martin Luther King Jr. Do we know anybody who knows anything about Martin Luther King Jr.? Whereupon my professor raised his hand and said, well, I do have this African American junior in my class who wrote a paper. This is to tell you. Anytime you do any kind of scholarly work or written work, you better make sure it's the best it can be if your name is on, all right? What happened was I found myself on a plane going to Washington, D.C. How ironic. because there had been a riot where I now live part of the year, because there had been a riot in Washington, D.C. when King was assassinated, and the public schools of Washington were going to reopen, and they didn't know, what shall we tell the kids? What shall we tell the kids about King? It was interesting to see my paper turned into a curriculum over the weekend. And of course, I was brought in because I was the token. Here I am, that person up on the team. Didn't matter. I was okay with that because I didn't have much experience then. But what a fascinating way to think about how King begins to enter into the canon of issues around social justice, working for the least of us, working for the garbage workers, etc. Fast forward to 1983. Are you aware that in 1983, we got a national holiday celebrating Martin Luther King? Now, I would like to call to your attention the shifts that might have occurred between King and the actual movement and the holiday that we get, and the curriculum materials that we often get now. I'm sure many of you know more about this than I do, and I look forward to learning from you. But here's what I would think about that now. Martin Luther King was a man of peace. He believed in nonviolence. Don't ever fight. No fighting. No fighting. Nonviolence. All right, that's what he was for. And his mission was, I want my children to be judged by the content of their character and not the color of their skin. Therefore, we can't see race. That's really a bad thing to do. We can't see all these other things. We're in an era of color blindness in some ways, because King has been reconfigured as a passive, colorblind, nonviolent figure, as opposed to positioning the ideas of King in a broader context that tells us what his work was really all about. So 1983, we got the holiday, and basically in 1994, some years later, we got something called the National Day of Service, which recast the King holiday as a National Day of Service. So King now is not only nonviolent, but the principle that's attached to Martin Luther King is one of service to humanity. It's a very interesting shift that is occurring around the history of this particular figure. You still with me on this? Oh yeah, I'm noticing a little bit of social justice. I like this group already. I'm loving it. All right. Somebody president told me I like you, but you got to always get me to make sure. All right. Okay. All right. So we get to 2008, and what is very fascinating to me in 2008 is the embrace of community service by Barack Obama and the Obama administration. And that got me thinking 2 years ago. And I've been thinking for 2 years in pretty sustained fashion about this particular president, this particular presidency. But what struck me was the call to community service, right? Answering the call to community service, and how community service is now elevated as a moral discourse, as a universal set of behaviors that we all engage in, and an inherently good thing. Well, what I want to do tonight is unpack what I call the sacred cow of community service. I want to think about how issues of race, class, gender, sexuality, there's lots that I could do with this that I cannot do in a short amount of time, particularly since you are hungry already, and focus on American youth. So this is going to feel like a bus tour of wherever you take a bus tour of. You know you went to France, you know you went to Italy, you know you went to England, you know you went to these European countries, but my gosh, it all blurs perhaps by the end, but you were there. So we may have to do something like that. So what I'd like to do is, these are the three parts of my talk tonight. First of all, I'd like to revisit President Obama's call to service and sort of talk a bit more about that in terms of what's involved with that. And there I want to link some ideas between service and citizenship and social inequality. Why is this important for us to even think about in the first place? And then second, I'd like to move on in the second part of my presentation to raise the question of who can answer this call. All right? How class, race, and age matter. So basically, I'm going to drill into this notion of community service in the second part and sketch out for you in a very preliminary way why this stuff is not as clear-cut and why service is very much tied to social inequality and social hierarchies, as is citizenship. And then in the third part of the presentation, I'd like to focus on what I call the least of these. poor and working class youth. And I want to focus particularly on high school youth, an age group that I know, and I sort of know in passing, but I know many of you have areas of expertise here, and I'd like you to help me think through in the end. And I would like to issue a different call to service for that particular population. You still there? Okay. Now, I told you this is going to be a lot. I did warn you, right? If anybody needs to go out and get a Snickers, banana, or whatever, for your table to share, something like that. All right? This is a social justice group. Okay? That's okay. I do understand. All right. So President Obama's call to service. Here is a graphic and a quote from his candidacy. And this is a really interesting quote to me, because this was before he was elected. He says, "I will ask for your service and your active citizenship when I am President of the United States. This will not be a call issued in one speech or program. This will be a cause of my presidency." Active citizenship and service. Now, what exactly does he mean by this? Let's just keep this in mind. Well, first of all, what comes to mind is the National Day of Service 2009. Let's just think about what Barack Obama began to do. The National Day of Service in 2009, or the King holiday, which by the way is coming up in 2 weeks. So you can think about this talk and sort of think about what I've said 2 weeks from now in terms of the coverage that it gets. All of a sudden, we see community service everywhere. This particular national holiday had a different face to it than the faces before. And it's a national holiday that came one day after the inauguration. All right? So what do we see? Well, observing the National Day of Service, January 19, 2009, what we see here is the Obama family very prominently featured in media representations of service. And I'd like you to think about these images that I put up here now, because I'm going to return to talk about them later in the talk. First of all, we see some pretty substantial gender differences in service. We see the president. Now, I should ask you this first of all. If you had just gotten elected president of the United States, and if you were the spouse of the president of the United States, and you knew the next day there was going to be a fancy celebration where you're inaugurated, if you were Michelle Obama, wouldn't you get your hair done or something like that? I mean, I just want to point this out as just sort of a gender kind of thing, but let me come back from there, all right? What we see is the president painting the wall, and I want to make sure I get the accurate quote here. Painting the walls of the Sasha Bruce House, which was a shelter for teens. What you see is the president doing manual labor, which is definitely not what the president was elected to do. So in some ways, what we're seeing is a certain class of folk engaging in certain types of labor or service that is considered community service, that is seen as a good and valuable thing for people to do. We also see Michelle Obama tutoring, which again is more the maternal, helping the child, based in education, but what we're seeing is them presenting a new image of service for the nation. But we also say, well, it's not just, now look at these poor children. Now, it's freezing out there. I forgot her name, which one this is. This is Sasha or Malia, but the has a little hat on out there. And basically what they're doing at the Calvin Coolidge High School is they're distributing food to people. And look how grateful this person is. Now, this person may be happy because perhaps I might do this myself if I met Barack Obama, even if there was no food involved. You can't tell from this particular graphic. But what you see in this graphic is the notion of modeling and representations of this particular presidency around service, beginning to live the material of the National Day of Service and citizenship and service to country being important. So, I got to keep up with myself now. All right. So why is this important? Well, what's at stake? Back to President Obama's words about service and active citizenship. First of all, to bring us up to speed really quickly, there are two dimensions of citizenship. There are rights and responsibilities that you get if you are a citizen. It may not feel that way, but you do get rights. Rights and entitlements. Right? Things that you can do, and places you can go, and services you can access because you are a citizen. But at the same time, what goes along with citizenship is the expectation of service. That you will somehow serve the community, the nation, the government, whatever, that's the dual-pronged issue of active citizenship. Receiving rights and entitlements and sort of adhering to your responsibilities. But as everyone in this room knows, all citizens are not equal, and all people are not equal. And what you find with citizenship is a huge degree of inequality in the very definition of citizen, which I'm putting up here as first-class citizens, second-class citizens, and non-citizens, which we have a very healthy, not healthy, but we have a really vigorous debate in this country right now about non-citizens around questions of undocumented aliens. And the whole notion of citizenship is very much a question of who belongs. And if you belong, what do you get because you belong? What are the rights and entitlements you get by belonging to a certain nation or a certain family or a certain community? And what are your responsibilities if you belong? And if you're a second-class citizen, maybe you get fewer rights and entitlements, but it may be because you have not lived up to your responsibilities to the group. You haven't engaged in the appropriate or sufficient service, as it were. And non-citizens who stand outside this whole question may think about ways to join the citizen population by engaging in service. Are you beginning to think about examples about how undocumented DREAM Act and people can become citizens if they've had military service for 2 years? Those kinds of things. How service begins to enter in a really interesting way around rights and entitlements. Okay, here we go. Now I'm going to go real fast here. Unequal citizenship, I'm going to argue, fosters unequal service. I'm going to give you 2 examples. One, if citizenship is unequal, first of all, let's try it this way. If you are a man or a woman in the past, if you were male or female, that was pretty profound unequal citizenship. And what that meant was you engaged in different kinds of service. If you were male, you had access to military service, national service. If you were female, you were denied access to national service, to military service. Instead, you might have engaged in community service, which might have been local, which might have been domestic, which might have been unpaid, but was not going to be as valued by the nation. So if we begin to look at unequal citizenship and how it fosters unequal service, we can say unequal citizenship gives some people more access to the values of society and denies other people access to the valued opportunities of society. And service can, in fact, be a great divide. Flipping this on its head, excuse me, not flipping this on its head, just what is that doing here? Okay, well, it's there, so let's talk about it. All right? Why is that there? Oh, back up, back up, back up. Nope. I don't know what that's doing there. Well, it is a gremlin in the machine. Okay. Now I want you to all just look up for a minute. Breathe. Okay, we're going to continue. I'm going to see if I can link this in. Because what I'm arguing here is that we have universal criteria for community service. This would be my question. Do we have universal criteria for community service? All right. What are the rules that are attached to community service? And you might begin to think about some of your own service activities here in terms of how closely they make the universal for community service. First of all, community service that is valued is typically unpaid. Ideal service is done by volunteers. Please remember this, because this is going to be really significant when I start talking about poor people and black people and how they relate to questions of service and being paid. All right? But ideally, community service is unpaid. Ideal community service is also altruistic, right? It's other-oriented contributions to the enhancement of the community. You're not supposed to have a vested interest in doing it. If you look at the Obama family giving away food and painting and tutoring, they didn't really, technically that's supposed to be altruistic, all right? Because they're not going to live in that school or work in that school or have that particular meal. They, in fact, are not paid and being altruistic. It's supposed to be freely chosen. If people force you into service, is it really as valued than if you chose it on your own. The person chooses to serve. Now, I'm sure the kids would prefer to do other things than giving out food in the cold on the National Day of Service, but maybe they freely chose that when they really thought about the need that's in this particular country. They said, we're going to choose to do that. And it involves sacrifice. The individual should give up something like the value of one's time. Now, these ideas of unpaid, altruistic, freely chosen, and sacrifice will come back in a few minutes as we go down this list. All right, I'm skipping that. Oh, I know what happened. One of my slides has disappeared. It may show up later on. We're now in part 2. All right, can I just tell you that? Yeah. We're in part 2 of the talk, so we're making better progress than I thought. All right? I don't know what happened to this slide. I bet you it's in here and it shows it later on. All right. Anyhow, what I want to now argue is that social class, race, gender, and sexuality and other categories really influence not only citizenship, but influence this whole concept of community service. Both opportunities that are available to people, and when people do engage in community service, how their activities are valued or not. And I want to cut into this by looking at class issues. Now, I consider social class to be pretty fundamental. We can think about, because I think that so much of this community service framework is normed on the experiences of middle-class folk, all right? So we're norming all this idea about community service on one population, and we aren't necessarily thinking about how differential access and differential valuation affects everybody else. So I want to talk about it in terms of class, but please keep in mind that race is very significant here because it's tightly bundled together with class in this country. I wouldn't want you to think that anytime I say social class that I mean white people in the social class, because actually the first example that I brought to you was the Obama family. And they're pretty, affluent, and they're black and middle class. So black middle class families have kind of a peculiar set of issues to negotiate with this in terms of their kids and service that we might talk about later on. But what I want to do now is just talk about social class and differential access and middle class families, what families can do and what they can't do. Well, first of all, I'm going to argue that that definition of universalistic community service is really a class-based definition. All right? For example, unpaid. Well, if people who have sufficient income and wealth can subsidize the community service activities of members of their family. All right? And even though we talk a lot in this country about individual income and all of that, this is a country that's predicated upon groups. It's predicated upon family, income, and wealth. It's really significant. All you have to do is try and get a divorce, and you will find that out real quickly. All right? So marriage and family are quite fundamental to property relations, and that's going to translate into a variety of things. So first of all, this universal definition of community service, no, unpaid. Who can really engage in unpaid service? Well, let's say middle-class women who basically have great jobs, and they can serve on professional boards, all right, for free. They can kind of give away all that time. Or kids who go to a great high school, and maybe there's a community service plan in their high school, so they don't have to have a job at McDonald's after school to save up for college. They can actually have a community service gig at the local soup kitchen, learning how to do whatever, and that's good for them, all right? So this whole notion of social class issues and how the class issues really very much shape access to opportunities. So unpaid, altruistic, I'm going to just skip over that one. Freely chosen. I think the middle-class families have numerous choices about where to engage in community service activities. And a lot of those community service activities, in fact, benefit the family members. You'll hear people say things like, I'm going to put it on my resume. It looks good if I do this volunteer work. All right, I'm going to get a skill set, and it's going to be really good for me. It's going to be good for somebody else. So I think there's a lot of choice there. This whole notion in this country that everybody has choice is really something that I think this notion of, wide open community service presents. And sacrifice. What value is given up? Well, on this one, I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure there is sacrifice actually here, to the degree that other people have to sacrifice. If your community service is in fact subsidized by the wealth of your family, what exactly are you sacrificing? All right. So, pushing a little more on this universal category, and let's see if we can get another little hierarchy. of community service. Types of service and differential value. Let me say a bit about this. Not all service is the same. Now, which service would you most want to be involved in? Leadership activities, where your community service is to run groups, engage in board service, fundraisers. These are all things that middle-class kids get to do. All right? These aren't just adults. These are kids get to do these things. If you look at some of the kids who arrive at college now who have their own corporations, you aware of this? All right? This is sort of the opportunity to have leadership activities and to practice those activities through community service engagement. Then we have the helping activities, which is tutoring, clerical, food pantry, which is what we saw Michelle Obama doing and the children doing. These are, by the way, I don't want you to think that I'm against any of these things. I'm really pointing out that there's a hierarchy here that we often overlook. When we paper over these activities under this banner of community service is really good for everybody. And then we have manual labor, cleanup and maintenance work. Now that's good. I mean, President Obama rolled up his sleeves and did manual labor, which is kind of a nice thing to see. But at the same time, how typical is that? Now, if you begin to think about, and by the way, race and class and gender and sexuality and all those categories shape how we see these particular categories based on who's doing it. So, for example, if I showed you a group of, let's say, 14 to 18-year-old African-American boys and Latino boys next to I-75 picking up trash, you might think, ooh, they're in a community service program instead of jail. Because that's, by the way, how community service has been interpreted in some communities. All right? Whereas if I show you a group of a Girl Scout troop that's next to, same highway, they're picking up trash, they have little bags on the National Day of Service. Everybody says, oh, they're so good. Look at those little girls engaging in all that service. It's manual work. Now, it's the same service, but in some ways we begin to attach value to that service based on the service itself, but also based on who's actually doing it, right? So when I start thinking about middle-class community service, yeah, the kind of community service that middle-class families want their kids to engage in is leadership activities. And helping activities and manual labor is good for character building, all right? It's good for things like, oh, we who are going to rule the world have to know how to be nice to the natives, all right? We have to learn how to be magnanimous to the poor. So once a year, let's get a turkey and go down to the food pantry and give it away. I know this sounds, I told you I was going to take on the sacred task. Now, if you gave a turkey away this year, Thanksgiving, that's great. This is not about you, all right? The turkey was good, the family was happy they got it, I'm sure you were happy. But this in no way is a substitute for public policy around social inequality. This is along the slippery slope from King all the way to where we are now with community service, with an eye toward thinking, how can we come back from that place to something a little different? All right? And you seem to be doing okay. I'm going to skip that one. Okay, here's the working class and poor. Let me talk a little bit about access here. First of all, if you're working low-paying jobs, this limits the time that you have available for unpaid or free service. One of the first questions people will ask is, well, how much am I going to get paid? This is a very reasonable question. But what can happen in this sort of discourse of community service and active citizenship and taking on your responsibilities and being altruistic and really giving back, all that kind of stuff, is that question can be seen as being selfish, self-serving, and really not being a team player. So, but if you're working two jobs, when do you engage in this community service? And yet I would argue that people do. But what happens is, the service that they engage in is not identified by these dominant institutions as community service, and it is not valorized as service because of that, and also because of who's doing it. So when I say altruistic, it's unrecognized community service, all right? Unrecognized. For example, which would be better? I've got a nice quote here if I can find it, but since my notes are so out of order, let's see if I can find my little quote. I love this quote. So here we go. This is a gentleman by the name of Paul Schmitz, who is a CEO of Public Allies. who says a white college student from a private college goes into a poor neighborhood and volunteers 4 hours a week, and that's considered exemplary. A poor kid who lives in that community and takes care of all the kids in that neighborhood 4 hours every day is not seen as a volunteer. That's a really powerful quote to me about unrecognized community service. All the things that people are already doing, but because it's not attached to this discourse of citizenship that is really, by the way, turned into a major, government and corporate sponsorships of these programs is just massive. That's another thing we can talk about and we can tell me about. But anyhow, social class and differential access, I think, really is quite significant here. Freely chosen, I think a lot of the community service that, particularly kids, and I alluded to it earlier, in working class and poor communities think about is they don't go immediately to this grandiose discourse of the National Day of Service. They don't think of Barack Obama rolling up his sleeves and painting the wall. They think of the kids in the orange jackets next to the highway doing community service. So they don't necessarily see the community services. The term has been claimed and has been polluted in some ways by these institutions, depending on who's using it. And the notion of sacrifice. Sacrifice is often not recognized if you think the person should be doing those things anyhow, right? So working class women, triple shift workers, mothers, community workers, people who get up every day and do the right thing, and I'm sure many of you know those people, or maybe many of you are those people, and you're sacrificing to engage in these community service activities. And yet that may be naturalized because people say, oh, well, black women just love to do those kinds of things. They just love to go, but black women are an extremely good example of this. We just love to make those cakes and take it over and go with the poor, with the sick, and, heal the wounded and all this kind of stuff. Take any drug addicted baby and the whole bit. So in some ways, because it's natural, which of course that grows from this naturalization notion of black women as mammies and nurturers. So we're just going back to some really old places around this notion of sacrifice. Or who should sacrifice? All right? It's okay if these kids are on the bottom and they're going to schools that are dropout academies. Many of you, I'm sure, have seen the film Waiting for Superman, all right, which uses the term dropout factories. It's a fascinating term around schools where people simply do not graduate. And we think about, let me just move on from that. All right, let me keep going. Oh, what do I want to say here? Oh, yeah, a couple of things before we move on from this to part 3. Well, I'm going to argue that there has to be a reclaiming of the concept of community service within certain communities, poor and working class communities, because the term doesn't have the same valence as it does in middle class communities, and it certainly doesn't have this happy, touchy-feely National Day of Service kind of the changing of the King holiday to turn it into that. First of all, if we look at the whole notion of service work and being in service, the term service is a devalued term. All right? Service work for, and I'm going to use now an African-American population because I think this is a really good example, is low-paid, unpaid labor that's been devalued, and it's part of a history of exploitation. So service work is what you want to avoid. You don't want to go back to doing service for free. You want a job where you're getting paid good money to not have to do this kind of service work. So all these things that people are asking people to do, cleaning and cooking and painting and feeding and all of that, is really, one has to have significant discussions about what paid and unpaid work in this country mean around questions of service work and exploitation. Right? The other thing about service as submission, not freely chosen. I'm in service to you. A service relationship in many communities is a relationship of domination and subordination. You are my servant. You are my, I don't know if I can say that. Can I say that? You're a pretty adult crowd, right? You are my slave. You are my bitch. All right? Oh, I'm sorry. I got your permission first, didn't I? I am the before dinner speaker. So don't have to go to extraordinary measures to keep you. All right? I will go low if I have to. All right? But anyhow, the notion of service and submission is completely different than freely chosen. All right? This notion of being in service and having to submit to a certain set of relationships. People who work know they really are having a tough time now with their labor issues. The notion of service, we're so happy you want to serve. Well, that's not wrong. Maybe I should take a good example. But the whole notion of people working in those kinds of jobs is clearly you're in service work, but you're submitting to all of these people who are telling you what to do all the time. Service doesn't have the same resonance, right? Community services, I've mentioned, is an alternative to jail time. All right, so we got to take that term back. And then alternative traditions of community service that are not recognized as community service. So we've got unnamed community service that needs to be named. And I think for certain populations it's going to be different. I would say for African American populations it's very much going to be church work. I mean, a lot of it organized through churches, a lot of social services, a lot of help has been organized through those institutions. But again, that's kind of what just black people do because they're religious, as opposed to that being a community service tradition that should be attached to citizenship. Okay, we're now in part 3. Let's cheer. All right? So now I want to move to this whole notion of what are we telling the kids about service? All right, where are we in this whole notion of let's pull us back from sort of unpack community service very briefly for you. I'll give you something far more sophisticated and less tongue-in-cheek, but this is to give you a feel. Pay college students to engage in community service. I kind of like that. Work study would be nice if you weren't always in the kitchen washing the dishes for your university, but you could somehow get a little work study gig that had community service attached to it. The training and leadership programs are very interesting. Those of you who are involved in AmeriCorps or Public Allies, my daughter was in Public Allies, so I'm a huge fan of this particular program. Yay! Shout out Public Allies. Or the Peace Corps, or the Teach for America. Now, what's really interesting about Teach for America, because this is quite controversial, is you've got kids coming out of fairly good colleges who are going into so-called bad schools to service the kids in the bad schools, which is different than what would community service look like for kids in the bad schools. All right, it's a different question entirely. And also, in terms of initiatives for college-age youth, campus-based service learning initiatives. I mean, the whole notion of involving service learning in so many courses that are now going out and sort of engaging people in this stuff. But again, is the goal here really to educate the student, or is the goal really to develop the community? All right. So, I mean, these programs are great, but I think they are just a start. And here's a major reason. I pulled up, and those of you who do research in this area know that high school dropout rates are just notoriously difficult to pin down. It depends on how you actually calculate them. All right, and this is not my area of expertise, but I wanted a simple chart just that would help me wrap my mind around this. And this is from 2006, from the American Census, U.S. Census, the American Community Survey. Dropout rates. This would be in 2006 of the population in this country that was age 18 to 25. What percentage did not finish high school? They left in the 10th, the 10th, I believe, and 11th grade. People like that as well. We're looking at close to 20% of black and Hispanic folk, 18 to 25. Not only are they not in college, they didn't finish high school. So we're losing a lot of people in high school. So let's skip college for a minute. Let's look at high school. Let's look at educational reform and see what's happening there around community service initiatives. Now, this is not making me happy at all. Oh. Now, what happened to that slide? That gremlin. See, you all knew I was going to go on and on, didn't you? Somebody got in here and took out some of my slides. So raise your hand. But anyhow, what I was going to say here that I apparently have just skipped over that slide as well, is that if we look at school reform efforts, they really don't look at high schools. They look at preschool. They look at testing and standards. They look at teacher training, making sure that kids are really good teachers. They look at a variety of things like that. Promoting excellence in schools, but what does that mean? But community service, considering that this was supposedly a really strong pillar of the administration, doesn't seem to show up in high school, but it shows up in college. And my point is that's a pretty significant gap in terms of here's a population that's falling outside of education reform. form. So here, I'm saying that what needs to happen, and one thing to consider, is to develop creative links between the Obama administration's two initiatives. One aimed at college affordability and the other at urban public school reform. And I would push that a little more and say to enhance school-based community service opportunities for poor and working class middle and high school youth. And I do have some literature that shows that if you go to a good school, your school is likely to provide for you many, many more community service activities than if you go to a school that isn't. So if we're looking at high schools as the front line of community service, as we look at colleges as the front line of community service, and it's going to be really spotty in terms of what people encounter. So I'm going to move on to, and hopefully the rest of my slides here, I'm going to just crap in front of you. I think we need to move on to something else. So I'm going to propose something a tad more radical. I think we need a new politics of community service. If we are thinking about poor and working class kids, if we're thinking about poor and working class black kids, girls, boys, anybody who's left out of that universal norm of community service that really matches a certain population and that obscures the inequality that it creates, all right, is I think we need another politics of community service. So I want to rethink community service and active citizenship for this population. High school aged kids who really are not in high school, they are not in college, they've fallen off, they're just on the block. All right, they're just on the block. So first of all, what I would do is to expand community service away from this kind of helping framework, helping the less fortunate, helping the needy, helping the downtrodden, and expand it to include community organizing as a skill set that should be included under community service. This would be providing leadership opportunities to high school aged kids who are already, by the way, developing their own grassroots programs. I think many of you do know this because this population is probably much more hooked into this than other groups are. All right, and working with them. And what might happen, instead of service through leadership in these traditional organizations, if we expanded this definition of community service to include community organizing, leadership training and problem solving would be core to community service. Now this opens up some real problems because then the kids are going to start thinking about problem solving, not just implementing the program that's there, but saying, why are the police smacking me in my head all the time? That's a problem. Let's think about this. What are some ways that we might, how do you think that came about? Who's in the police? Who are you? Where are you located? What's your community like? Why can't we get trash collection in our neighborhood? Why is my school so horrible? Those kinds of things. And by the way, the kids are already asking these questions. The issue is to develop places, organizational places where they can develop leadership skills around grappling with those particular issues. Which, by the way, if I were to think back to something like, what was that place? Was it Birmingham when all those kids kind of got, left school and got the fire hoses turned on them, and the grown-up said, uh-oh, I guess we have to go support our kids. All right. When you look at political activism, the kids are at the front. The youth are usually at the front. South Africa is an excellent example of that. So what I'm saying is there are kids who are clearly school-age kids, not little kids are from a different situation, but adolescent kids, people who are coming to adulthood in this situation and realizing there is no place for me. There is no place for me in high school. There is no place for me in college. What is my place? Expanding community service to include community organizing begins to develop that kind of place. And by the way, if I might go a little further, I would pay them to do it. Not doesn't have to be a whole lot, but I would pay them. Because if you value somebody's time and somebody's service, you pay them. And I think that begins to address this whole, what are some of the norms around why people won't engage in community service? All right. So that's one thing. The second thing would be to link community organizing to community development. So it's not enough just to have your skill set and your organization that you're forming. This is developing an other-oriented framework on the world. And what our current service initiatives are encouraging everybody to do is to really embrace this help the unfortunate, help the needy, paint, etc. framework that does not interrogate the systems of power that create those structures from the very beginning. When I start talking about community service, community organizing, and community development, these are very powerful terms, or can be very powerful terms to working class and poor people. But these, of course, are the terms that academics have sort of taken away. All right, well, that was then. We did that then. I don't do that anymore. I say, let's take them back. Link community service initiatives by and for, not for poor and working class youth, by them, all right, that they run, and for them if needed, with community development initiatives in their own neighborhoods. So I don't think people need any more people coming in and giving them more cans of peas. All right? The notion is really, how does one develop organizations that empower people in local communities? And that, to me, is an interesting community service. Let me finish with one graphic. And it's there. This is an organization that I would like to just point out because I love this little group. This is a group of kids, a community-based initiative in Washington, D.C. And I'm sure many of you would know about organizations like this. But they're called Words, Beats, and Life. They have both an internet presence and they have an actual physical presence in a neighborhood in Washington, D.C. They are very much interested in D.C. urban arts. They do workshops. They have a journal of hip-hop culture. They have a university project where they actually go into classrooms and teach those above them. And they have something called the Cypher, a hip-hop business incubator, which begins to get at this whole notion of social entrepreneurship, which is what many youth are interested in. They don't want to be on the dole anymore. They've seen that the dole, whether it's the public dole or the corporate dole or the service dole, is not a good place to be. So the notion of social entrepreneurship, where one is developing, organizing and developing one's own business for the purposes of community empowerment, is a very powerful idea that I think we need to take account of. So I wanted to finish with them because, I'm sure they're not making a whole lot of money as much. They may have those little hard scrabble jobs to get by. But basically, when you're committed to something, like social justice, you'll find your way. Thank you. Nobody died. Nobody killed anybody. We do that without food. Are we kind of done for now, or do we have a question or two? What's the time? I don't mind. I think it's a question about hungry. I mean, I'm hungry.
Hi, I just had a question. I wanted to go back to what you were talking about in terms of asking students to get into community service. I wanted to go back a couple of slides where you were talking about getting students into community service in high school. And I think it comes down to, they're disaffected. A lot of these kids are disaffected. They're not interested. They're dropping out. A lot of kids actually, by ninth grade whether they're going to make it through high school. I mean, the dropout rate, you can tell by ninth grade. The other thing is, a lot of times civics isn't taught anymore. And they're not taught civics, which is another kind of aspect of citizenship. So a lot of kids, if they're taught citizenship, which is a whole another raging debate, do we teach citizenship and do we teach civics to these kids? So if we are interested in getting them to think of themselves as citizens and as people who are invested in doing something for their community and in their community because they are a part of their community, I think we have a better chance of getting them involved in these kinds of projects. So I think part of it is thinking about what the curriculum is, because they're worried about whether or not they can pass their math tests and their English tests and their science tests, and that's all very well and good and important. But we also have to think in broader terms like you were suggesting.
I actually think, this is going to sound horrible because I've been a lifelong educator, but I really think that I wouldn't put my faith in the schools. And I know that's really disheartening for those of you who work in schools, so I'm going to try and fix that a little bit, all right? Because I think schools were not set up to do this. The kind of thing that I have in mind, the kind of critical thinking, the kind of empowerment, would be a student who knows his or her rights, who has developed skills of literacy, multiple skills of literacy, to express those rights. And literacy now doesn't just mean reading and math. It means cultural literacy. It means knowing how to read the media. It means knowing how to do videos. It means knowing how to do the internet, how to use YouTube. I mean, I think there are forms of literacy that these kids have that I don't even know what I'm missing. I mean, I'm that behind the wave at this point.
But I think it's critical. I think they have some kind of literacy.
But it's not critical. Well, that's the issue. That's the issue with the critical thinking. So when I think about community organizing, I think of leadership skills as critical thinking. Maybe I should say that. I don't think of leadership skills as I'm going to, bring you into the army and you're going to learn the chain of command and you memorize these 5 things and you can tell the people underneath you how to do that. That's discipline. All right, that's classroom discipline. That's how to make them sit down and do stuff. I'm talking about leadership where it's problem solving. And in order to do problem solving, you do have to have critical capacity. But I would raise the question, why would it be in the best interest of the schools to develop critical thinking among students? Because one of the first things they're going to do is think critically about you. This is the problem that I have routinely teaching African American studies. All right? The first thing is, well, we don't know about your class now, Dr. Collins. I said, wait a minute. All right, my class is off limits. You can be critical about everything else, all right? So having said that, where are the spaces where people can engage these kinds of issues? Well, the kids are already doing it, they're just not doing it in the formal curriculum of school. And in fact, I would argue that probably many of the schools that our children go to push them out the door because they can't do it there. They do it elsewhere. So if they're already in the community thinking about stuff, but not necessarily thinking in a sustained fashion the way you're saying, why would that not be the site of getting them involved in, and when I say community service, doesn't the term sound kind of imperial now? When after the talk that I've been given, it almost like, why would we want to involve them in that kind of community service? Wouldn't we want to basically redefine that term and take that back? So, just to follow up a little bit about the whole notion of teaching citizenship, I think one of the worst things that could possibly happen is a dull, dry class on citizenship imposed upon young people. All right? And we've been in those classes. I can just think, oh, please, when will this be over? That kind of thing. That's very different than exposing kids to real-life situations where we ask, what are the questions around citizenship that are involved here? The case method is very, very useful, as opposed to memorizing the Constitution. When I taught school, I had kids who were routinely yelled at by, these were elementary school kids, they were routinely yelled at by the store that they shopped at. I mean, the shopkeeper often thought that they were stealing stuff. Sometimes they were, but often they weren't. Most of the time they weren't. And they'd come to school angry all the time. We're angry. We don't have any rights. I said, wait a minute. What can you do? What rights do you have and what rights don't you have? And we engaged in problem solving with them about all the things that they could do in response to the treatment that they were receiving from this particular person. Not just one response of being angry, but multiple responses. We used drama. They acted out a boycott. They made signs. I said, if you want, you can go to his store. It's your right as a citizen to get on the sidewalk, hold up a sign and say, don't shop here, because this guy discriminates against us. That links them to history lessons around social justice initiatives that came from those exact kinds of real-life situations. Now, that's an organizational example. That's a development example. That is might be called something related to service, but my concern is that all of this attention to service just strips the juice out of the energy that's there. So I think you're spot on right about the schools, but I don't know if, and I applaud those of you who can create those spaces in classrooms, but I don't look to an institution like the public schools as leading the way on this. They will follow if somebody gets out in front.
Dr. Collins and actually everyone, first I'd like to make kind of observation, and then from Dr. Collins and everyone, see what you like to do. There will be a conversation tomorrow afternoon with Dr. Collins that's open to everyone, so that we have an opportunity to follow up. Having said that, my question would be, shall we break now and have dinner? Do you want to take another question or two and do that? So I'll leave it up to Dr. Collins. And
I think you should break now and have dinner, because I've been standing up, and I'm just as hungry as you are, and I will be back tomorrow, and I encourage all of you to come with questions from tonight's presentation. If there are things that you think about between today and tomorrow, I can certainly pick up these particular issues tomorrow. What I was going to talk about tomorrow is my work. I mean, the craft of doing the work, of taking this whole notion of social justice from kind of the theoretical frame today to the actual crafting of projects that are that. So that's what I'm going to do. So it doesn't really matter to me. I'm very happy to talk to you tomorrow about what most interests you. But I'd like to thank you for being a fabulous audience. All right? And let's see.
And thank you for